Regulations are designed to ensure that a small group of people get to profit and benefit from a controlled system. We don't get those advantages, so we continuously see more laws and regulations put in place, supposedly to protect us, but it's really just to benefit the chosen few. It never seems to get any better for the bottom 90% of people. What's really going on? You came here for the truth, so let me unveil that for you. Today we are going to look at this issue, how the next financial crisis is being set up today. There are various instances of this occurring in the recent past. I am going to talk about that today. I want to cover many other issues, including gold, including different currencies. So much to cover. Let me begin with this article out of CNBC. You're talking about a new law that's been signed, the biggest rollback of bank regulations since the global financial crisis. Now, this comes at a time when we are seeing more delinquencies out there. We are seeing more problems that have been rising to the surface. And yet, what do? Roll back. Roll back. The measure designed to ease rules on all but the largest banks passed both chambers of Congress. Backers say that the legislation will lift burdens unnecessarily put on small to medium-sized lenders by the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act, and it will boost economic growth. All right. Now, these burdens that they're talking about here are always there to make sure that we don't have another problem. So we get into these messes, then they sign this thing into law saying, look, we fixed the problem, and that's only going to keep this system going so that it doesn't fall any further. Okay, it shows that they're acting. But when times get a little tough, they just roll it back. Glass-Steagall, Dodd-Frank, we are seeing the rollbacks occurring. I got a big problem with this, obviously, because, look, these regulations that are put in place, you and I, we have to face them. Because when it really comes down to it, the big corporations, they get their way. They don't pay taxes, they have all the loopholes, and they will do everything that they can in their power because they have their people in the positions of government, and they decide what's going to happen. You and I, we don't get those advantages, never. All right, so at this time now, we are seeing all of these basically lending standards being relaxed. You are seeing these so-called burdens being lifted, and ultimately the average corporation, financial corporation, needs to keep less reserves. Opponents, however, have argued that the changes could open taxpayers to more liability if the financial system collapses or increase the chances of discrimination in mortgage lending. So I'll get into this more in a moment. Now, mortgages are something I talk about all the time. Interest rates, it's so important to understand. The measure eases restrictions on all but the largest banks. It raises the threshold to $250 billion from $50 billion, under which banks are deemed too important to the financial system to fail. So there we go. Too big to fail is certainly back. Those institutions also would not have to undergo stress tests or submit so-called living wills, both safety valves designed to plan for financial disaster. So they put these protections in place following the financial crisis, and they said, look, this right here is going to protect the financial system, and so stocks could rise further. Don't worry, we kept everything safe for you. But then corporate profits started to wean a little bit, and we started to have a little bit of problems here. Too many people were, worried about the system. So let's give it a boost. Let's increase those corporate profits. And how do we do that? Well, take a look at this. It eases mortgage loan data reporting requirements. I love that. I mean, when I hear that, it brings a smile to my face. Eases mortgage loan data reporting requirements. Now, what are we talking about here? Well, you can see this looking at previous instances where similar things have happened. Oh, you don't have a job? You don't have any income? Don't worry about it. Just sign on the dot. I've shown you the actual advertisements before. Just sign on the dot. You'll do just fine. You know how much fraud is going on in the mortgage industry today? It is overwhelming. It's happening in Canada too. They found out, they actually brought that information to the public. I showed you here how with Home Capital and even after, I believe it was Desjardins company in Canada and one more, the name escapes me at this time, but I did a video about it, how they did find fraudulent paperwork going through. They would just fake the income. So if a person needed, let's say, $100,000 a year in order to get that mortgage, well, trust me, they're going to be earning $100,000 a year according to that paperwork that they signed. That's not the case, but that's the way it works. And this has happened all throughout the financial crisis, the housing crisis and so on. All right. It would add some safeguards for student loan borrowers, also requiring credit reporting companies to provide free credit monitoring services that will have no impact whatsoever. Of course, people just spend what they want and they don't do anything. The only way is to simply, block them from doing that. There's not going to be any safety valves anymore. They want that relaxed. They want to keep the minimum amount of reserves. There are instances, imagine this, these financial companies, they need to keep, in many instances, 3% reserves. 3%, not even the 10%, but just 3. What do you think's going to happen? Truthfully, what do you think's going to happen if you have such a small percentage in reserves? What about the FDIC, the individual, institution, if you want to call it that, that's there to backstop any failure of a particular bank? They can't do that. There's no way. If 10% of people would pull their money out of the bank, I bet you would have an immediate crisis. 10%. But of course, people don't want to do that. They don't want to keep their money under their mattress and so on. So life just goes on. And you can just lower those lending standards until it's basically, right at the bottom. And that's just the way it goes. I'm going to show you this here. Mortgages, interest rates, something I talk about all the time. Very quickly, mortgage rates have continued their upward march this week, extending the most prolonged increase in rates in 46 years. That is very big. Now, mortgage rates so far in 2018 have had the most sustained increase to the start of the year in over 40 years. So it goes into more details. I just want to show you that we're looking at an increase in mortgage rates. You could look at the Fed funds rate. That's one thing. But mortgage rates and other interest rates that people have to borrow with are really what's more important. Because, for example, you can have all the big banks out there increase their mortgage rates by, let's just say, 1%. They don't have to wait for the Fed to do anything. They could do that anytime they want. Of course, they become less competitive if they do so. They all usually act together somewhat. So that's very important, that as interest rates rise up, financial transactions become more expensive. You have less loaning happening out there. And of course, corporate profits start suffering and so on. Okay, I want to get into so many different issues today, talking about currencies. I want to talk about more, but I wanted to show you this Argentine peso to the US dollar. It's unbelievable, the devaluation that we've seen in such a short period of time here. I mean, basically 1 year on this chart here, 1 year time frame. Nobody thought in May of 2017 that it would ever be where it is today. Essentially half its value. But that's the way it goes in a fast, really, and it only gets worse. It becomes parabolic, right? So you have today it's pretty bad, tomorrow it's really bad, and then it's extremely bad, and then it's, okay, what the hell's going on? Turkish lira also suffering here, and I believe it is at a record low. Turkey is trying desperately to halt a collapse in its currency that could trigger an economic crisis just as the country prepares to vote in an election, which will be fraudulent. The lira has plunged about 20% against the US dollar since the start of the year, hurt by a broader move by investors to switch money out of emerging markets and into the United States. All right, more details there. Of course, they hiked interest rates to 16.5%. So we have major jumps here. Looking at this, just ultimately hurting the average individual. When you look at what's going on in other countries, you see the same thing. Massive increase in interest rates as the people are just suffering and suffering. They don't have any value left in their currency. They don't know what to do. The average person doesn't know what to do, and that's why it's very important that you follow along what's going on. That's why I really commend every one of you who looks into this information every day. You could be watching television, Netflix, and you could be watching, whatever, sports or something, but this is truly very important. Emerging markets here, just wanted to show you the fact that these have been declining now for a little while. If I could show you the dates here for a second. At the beginning of the year, basically, the emerging markets have really been suffering. Whether it is, I've shown you here before the different examples, but we're moving back into levels not seen since last year, basically December of last year. So it's important to note how far emerging markets will go in the coming weeks. I'm actually getting a little concerned about that. Just wanted to touch on the fact that the different mortgage rates, whether you're looking at 30 or 15 year, they have been increasing here quite a bit. You've seen some changes happening. Now, this is not what occurred in Canada, for example. I think it was more like just a straight line downward. But many areas we've seen that uptick in this mortgage rate increase, and that's going to burden people. They can't afford it. I just covered a video yesterday talking about that. If you're interested, go to the previous video to this one. I covered why this is very important. Let me move on. Looking at Russia, actually, their central bank has accumulated large amounts of gold recently, and they are now nearing 2,000 tons of gold. It is some very large numbers right now. Now, some central banks around the world, like Canada, they think that this is a relic and ultimately doesn't deserve a place in the country's reserves, so they have sold it all. There's nothing left. Okay, look at it today. In Russia, they've done the exact opposite. They've been buying it all up. China's been doing the same. I wanted to show you this right here. Two charts to show you. Russian gold reserve additions versus the mining production. Actually, their mining production has increased quite a bit as well. So since we're looking at 2012 until today, it's basically been consistently rising. Even if you look back from 2006 where it was, it's also a general trend on the way up. So I think that they have one very, very admitted plan, and that is the accumulation of more gold. Just making that point. You can do what you want with it. And this, I want to know, presented without any comment, gold reserves by country. United States is at 8,100, and then you have Russia, 1,900, and China, 1,842. Well, how many people out there watching this video, how many people believe that that number is accurate? That's all I'm asking. Is that number accurate? Is it higher? Is it lower? I'm not going to give my opinion. You tell me. That's all for this video. If you found it informative, please give me a thumbs up. And last but not least, if you found the video informative, I know that you will find my books, The Money GPS, and my newer release, Global Economic Collapse, even more informative. You can actually flip through these books. All you need to do is go over to Amazon. There are links in the description of this video. You click over there, brings you over where there's a look inside feature, and that's going to allow you to flip through the pages of these books to see if you like them. Take care.